You really think you belong here?" The words hit the silent boardroom like a dropped gavel, freezing the dozen executives mid-gesture, their pens hovering above contracts and coffee cups trembling with the slight quiver of tension. Aaliyah Carter, 23, stood near the corner, broom in hand, eyes scanning the polished oak table where Richard Hawthorne, the CEO with a sharp gray suit and tighter-than-necessary tie, leaned forward, his expression a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. The fluorescent lights reflected off the glass walls, casting streaks across the marble floor, illuminating the dust motes swirling gently in the air, dancing almost like spectators to the quiet storm brewing. Aaliyah had been here before, countless late nights wiping fingerprints from windows, organizing papers others ignored, her existence almost invisible amidst the hum of printers, the low drone of the air system, and the occasional murmur from overworked interns. But today something had shifted. A folder left carelessly on the edge of the table had caught her eye, and the subtle irregularity in the contract inside seemed too glaring to ignore. Her heart thumped in measured beats against the chest, a rhythm she had trained herself to follow whenever pressure mounted. Stepping closer, she let her hand rest lightly on the folder, her fingertips grazing the corner as if testing its weight against the gravity of the room itself. Around her, the boardroom felt impossibly still, the usual chatter of business tactics, the shuffle of papers, even the hiss of the espresso machine in the lobby, all faded into a vacuum of expectation. Aaliyah drew a subtle breath, feeling the cool air conditioning brush against her skin, the faint scent of polish and coffee mixing in a way that somehow anchored her presence to this space. Her eyes caught Richard's, a brief lock, and she noticed the way his silver-brown brows drew together, an imperceptible tightening that hinted at the beginnings of recognition, of potential doubt. The clock ticked softly, almost in sympathy with the unspoken tension, and Aaliyah allowed herself a small, private acknowledgement of the skill and diligence that had brought her here, the long nights of reading, of memorizing clauses, of understanding nuances that most considered boring or unnecessary. Her voice, when it came, was quiet yet unwavering. "Sir, this clause could create significant risk for the company." Immediately, a ripple passed through the room. Heads turned, eyes widened, some blinked rapidly, processing what had been said, their silence only amplifying the weight of her words. Richard's initial smirk faltered for the briefest instant before he straightened, leaning back slightly, assessing the young woman who had dared, without title or power, to speak truth to authority. The faint scratch of her shoes against the polished floor, the soft swish of her uniform, the subtle flare of her sleeve as she gestured toward the document. All of it framed a tableau of calm courage in the eye of potential reprimand. Outside the large windows, the city hummed unknowingly, oblivious to this pivotal moment within these walls, where a single act of observation, a single willingness to step forward, had begun to tilt the balance of power, hinting at revelations yet unseen, a story still unfolding that promised far more than the polished veneer of wealth and hierarchy might suggest. The silence stretched for a heartbeat longer than seemed natural, and Aaliyah felt the weight of every gaze in the room pressing against her like a tangible force. The sunlight slanting through the tall glass panes caught her braid, highlighting the subtle sheen of determination on her face, and she could see Richard shifting slightly in his chair, the lines of his jaw tightening as he examined the folder again, his eyes darting over numbers and clauses that would have eluded most of the room. Each page turned with the faint whisper of paper, a sound amplified by the stark quiet, and she took a careful step closer, hands folded neatly in front of her, offering no aggression, only focus. The interns at the back held their breath, some tilting their heads to catch every syllable, the usually buzzing office now a frozen tableau of attention. Aaliyah's mind raced, recalling late nights studying corporate law, deciphering dense financial documents that most people avoided as if the words were poison, and she realized that all those hours had prepared her for this very moment. She pointed delicately to a specific line, the ink bold against the crisp white page, and spoke with measured clarity. "If this clause is executed as written, the company could assume liability far beyond what is prudent, exposing us to unnecessary risk." There was a pause, a collective inhale. and she watched as Richard's fingers brushed over the edge of the paper, lingering on the numbers and terminology that would have gone unnoticed without her observation. The air seemed to thicken with anticipation, the distant hum of the air conditioning now a barely audible undertone to the tension. She did not flinch as he leaned back, his hand gripping the armrest, eyes scanning her intently, a flicker of recognition passing through his expression, the first hint that her words were piercing through the barrier of his expectation. Aaliyah allowed herself a subtle exhale, steadying her heartbeat, noting the faint creak of the leather chair as he shifted, the way his polished shoes reflected the overhead light, and how every movement, every slight tightening of his grip, betrayed the consideration now given to her assessment. Outside, the city continued obliviously, the distant honking of cars and muffled pedestrian chatter contrasting sharply with the electric focus within the boardroom, and she could sense the room holding on the precipice of change. Aaliyah straightened slightly, her posture unyielding yet calm, projecting a quiet authority that seemed to ripple outward, touching the edges of every person present, an unspoken acknowledgement of capability. She gestured lightly to another section of the contract, tracing the flow of terms with her fingertip as she continued. This adjustment here aligns the responsibilities correctly and ensures that we mitigate potential exposure, protecting both the company and our stakeholders. Every eye in the room followed her movements. The usually composed executives now caught in the rare vulnerability of listening intently to someone they had previously dismissed. The sunlight shifted slightly, casting long shadows across the floor, framing Aaliyah in an almost cinematic contrast of light and determination. And in that suspended moment, it became clear that this was not a confrontation, but a revelation, a subtle demonstration of skill and intellect quietly commanding recognition without the need for authority or title. Richard leaned forward, the subtle click of his pen against the polished table marking the pause in the boardroom that now felt almost sacred, the hum of the ventilation system and the distant murmur of city traffic fading into a quiet backdrop for the revelation unfolding. Aaliyah Carter kept her gaze steady, her hands lightly resting on the contract, the soft rustle of paper as she adjusted her position, the only sound between her words and the shifting attention of the executives. Her voice, calm and measured, outlined the specific clauses with precision, each explanation a thread weaving clarity through the complexity of legal terminology, and she could see the effect on Richard as his eyes followed her every gesture, a subtle narrowing that spoke of both surprise and the first seeds of respect. The sunlight sliding through the tall windows caught the edge of her sleeve, the gleam reflecting off the polished floor, casting elongated shadows that seemed to stretch toward the corners of the room, where assistants and junior staff watched with bated breath, sensing the gravity of this unanticipated insight. Aaliyah highlighted potential outcomes, her words precise, flowing naturally from the hours of preparation and study she had invested in understanding the nuances of corporate contracts, the implications of each stipulation laid bare with careful clarity. Richard's fingers lingered on the page, his body tense yet attentive, the usual confidence tempered by the undeniable accuracy of her observations, the room holding the quiet electricity of a moment suspended between authority and recognition. The interns whispered to each other, careful to avoid attracting attention, their faces reflecting both awe and disbelief at the courage and knowledge displayed by someone they had previously dismissed as invisible, and Aaliyah felt the subtle shift in energy as respect quietly replaced doubt, an acknowledgement forming in the silent communication of glances and slight nods. She traced her finger along a particularly convoluted paragraph, explaining the potential liabilities and mitigations, her articulation smooth, unflustered, the clarity of her reasoning breaking through layers of assumption that had previously guided decisions blindly. Outside, the city remained unaware, the distant horn of a truck, the footsteps on the street, all muted by the sheer intensity of the room's focus. And in that insulated bubble, Aaliyah's competence radiated, commanding attention without demand, leaving an impression that extended beyond the immediate observation of risk to a deeper understanding of diligence, insight, and capability. Richard finally exhaled, the first long, deliberate release in the room since her intervention, and leaned back, the chair creaking softly under the shift, his eyes reflecting contemplation. The recognition that this young woman, previously overlooked, possessed an intellect and perspective that could not be ignored, hinting at the larger revelations that were yet to unfold. The room still suspended in anticipation, the soft glow of sunlight framing Aaliyah as she stood composed, quietly, asserting her presence and influence without raising her voice or altering the natural rhythm of her careful, deliberate explanation. The tension in the boardroom was palpable, every subtle movement magnified by the hush that had settled over the space. Aaliyah Carter's eyes followed the reflection of the afternoon sun on the glass walls, tracing the elongated shapes of the executives frozen mid-motion, their collective attention pinned to her quiet authority. She reached for the next document, a neatly stacked folder with a header that gleamed under the light, and gently slid it across the polished oak surface toward Richard Hawthorne, who lifted an eyebrow in curiosity, his usually impervious demeanor showing the first crack of surprise. The air carried a faint scent of coffee and polished wood, grounding the room in an almost cinematic clarity as she continued her measured explanation, each word carefully selected, her voice even and controlled, filling the space with undeniable competence. The slight rustle of paper and the soft scuff of her shoes on the marble floor punctuated the stillness, emphasizing the gravity of the moment. Richard leaned forward, fingertips brushing the edge of the table, absorbing the intricacies of her observations, the careful articulation revealing potential vulnerabilities that had previously gone unnoticed. Around them, the assistants and junior staff shifted subtly, exchanging glances, their attention rapt as they watched someone they had underestimated demonstrate clarity and insight that could not be dismissed. Aaliyah highlighted the contractual nuances with precision, her hands moving in deliberate gestures over critical sections, drawing attention to the areas of risk, potential liabilities, and corrective measures. The sunlight shifted, slanting across the table to catch the glint of her pen as it hovered above a highlighted clause, a silent indicator of her preparedness and foresight. Richard's expression softened imperceptibly, the rigid lines of his face relaxing as the realization dawned that the young woman before him possessed not only understanding, but also the courage to speak truth without title or rank, the room becoming a stage where intellect quietly commanded respect. She paused, allowing the moment to settle, her composure unwavering, and the faint hum of the air conditioning became the only background noise as Richard absorbed the full weight of her insight. The subtle acknowledgement of her capability was evident in the almost imperceptible nods from colleagues, the slight lean forward of Richard as he scanned the highlighted sections once more, the room suspended in a delicate balance between authority and recognition. Outside, the distant city life continued unabated, oblivious to the microcosm of revelation occurring within these walls, where one person's attention to detail, dedication, and unwavering presence had begun to reshape the perception of power, competence, and influence, creating a quiet but profound shift in the dynamics of the room as Aaliyah stood poised, calm, and undeniably present, the soft echo of her words lingering like a gentle but firm assertion of intellect and integrity. Richard's eyes lingered on the highlighted clauses, a subtle tension still in his posture, yet the sharp edge of disbelief had softened into focused consideration, each line revealing the accuracy of Aaliyah Carter's meticulous review. She shifted slightly, the faint rustle of her uniform punctuating the silence as she moved a hand to gesture toward the corrective notes she had added in the margins, her handwriting neat, deliberate, the contrast of the ink against the crisp paper reflecting her precision and care. The boardroom seemed to contract around her presence, every observer caught between admiration and the realization that authority was no longer defined solely by title or wealth. Richard exhaled slowly, the sound muted yet resonant in the high-ceilinged room, and his gaze traced the lines of her annotations, absorbing not just the content but the confidence and depth behind them. The sunlight through the glass walls shifted slightly, casting an intricate pattern of shadows across the table, framing the unfolding revelation with an almost cinematic gravity, highlighting the deliberate calm in Aaliyah's stance, the subtle tilt of her chin, the steady cadence of her explanation. Aaliyah's voice remained measured, a clear and unwavering guide through the legal complexities, drawing attention to risk factors, mitigations, and contingencies, articulating insights that challenged assumptions previously taken for granted. The executives leaned forward subtly, each movement echoing in the quiet room, pens and tablets momentarily forgotten, as the scope of her analysis became evident. Richard adjusted in his chair, fingertips lightly tapping the edge of the polished surface as he absorbed the implications, the faint reflection of sunlight glinting off his wristwatch, a small detail that contrasted with the magnitude of the knowledge being conveyed. Aaliyah's calm authority seemed to extend beyond her words, the room itself responding to the quiet power she exuded, every glance, every shift of posture reinforcing the acknowledgement that her perspective could not be overlooked. The soft hum of the air conditioning, once unnoticed, now underscored the intensity of the focus, blending with the subtle scrape of paper, the gentle shuffle of feet, and the occasional intake of breath as she highlighted areas of vulnerability and oversight, her explanations precise, layered, and thorough. Richard's eyes moved with careful deliberation, scanning, questioning, and reconciling the revelations before him, the subtle arc of recognition in his expression confirming that the balance of perception had begun to shift, and the authority once solely his was now quietly, undeniably influenced by the insight, intellect, and composed presence of Aaliyah Carter, a young woman whose preparation, observation, and unflinching clarity had begun to redefine the room and hint at consequences far beyond the immediate discussion, leaving a palpable tension that promised further revelation in the unfolding moments to come. The boardroom felt suspended in time, every person caught between anticipation and disbelief as Aaliyah Carter adjusted her stance, subtly straightening the folds of her uniform, her gaze never leaving the contract spread before Richard Hawthorne. The afternoon sun shifted through the tall windows, casting warm streaks across the polished floor and highlighting the faint reflection of her determined expression in the glass walls, a visual echo of the quiet authority she exuded. She reached slowly for the next document, her fingers brushing the edges with practiced care, and began to outline potential scenarios, her voice steady and deliberate, each sentence carrying clarity and confidence that seemed to ripple outward, altering the energy of the room. Richard's hands hovered near the folder, the faint metallic click of his watch marking the tension, his eyes scanning her notes, reading with a growing recognition of both precision and foresight. Around them, assistants and junior executives leaned slightly forward, subtle glances exchanged, their attention rapt as they absorbed the meticulous reasoning that had drawn the room into a shared focus on the unfolding revelations. Aaliyah moved with purpose, indicating specific clauses and potential mitigations, her articulation smooth, each explanation layered, presenting the risks and safeguards with a calm authority that left no room for dismissal. The sunlight reflected on the glossy surface of the table, catching the ink of her annotations, emphasizing the deliberate care and preparation she had invested, the quiet strength behind her presence. Richard's expression shifted imperceptibly, the sharp lines softening as understanding settled in, the realization dawning that the young woman, previously unseen, was guiding him through complexities he had assumed would be overlooked or misunderstood. The room held its breath, the low hum of the ventilation system now a subtle underscore to the moment, punctuating each careful word as it filled the space with weight and significance. Aaliyah's movements were fluid but measured, the subtle scrape of her shoes against the marble floor and the gentle rustle of paper creating a rhythm that matched the intensity of the insight she delivered, each gesture reinforcing her point with quiet elegance. The executives, once confident in their assumptions, now followed her lead, heads inclined, eyes scanning the documents she had highlighted, recognizing for the first time the depth of analysis and knowledge that transcended her role. Outside, the city continued unaware, the distant sounds of traffic and pedestrian life muted by the concentration within, and in this insulated world, Aaliyah's careful, unflinching clarity began to reshape perception, her presence alone demonstrating that competence and insight could command respect without the necessity of authority or title, leaving a lingering anticipation that the following moments would reveal even more about the scope of her understanding and the implications of her intervention. Richard finally straightened in his chair, the subtle creak of leather punctuating the room as his eyes scanned Aaliyah Carter once more, the sunlight glinting off the edge of her folder, highlighting the meticulous notes she had taken, each annotation a testament to preparation and understanding. Her hands rested lightly on the table, fingers splayed in a relaxed but confident posture, and she allowed the quiet weight of her presence to settle over the boardroom, a calm assertion that spoke louder than any words could. The executives leaned in imperceptibly, their pens paused mid-air, tablets forgotten, as the clarity of her reasoning became undeniable, the earlier dismissal fading into silent acknowledgement. Richard's expression softened further, the initial disbelief giving way to a measured curiosity, a subtle reassessment of not just the contract but the person who had brought it to his attention. Aaliyah gestured toward the final section of the document, tracing a line with her fingertip, her explanation precise, articulating both risk mitigation and strategic opportunity, each sentence deliberate, delivered with a quiet authority that drew the attention of even the most senior observers. The faint hum of the ventilation system underscored the intensity, the sunlight creating a pattern of elongated shadows that danced across the marble floor, framing the scene in a cinematic contrast that highlighted her composed determination. She paused briefly, allowing the room to absorb the weight of her analysis, each executive processing the implications, the subtle shift in energy signaling the growing acknowledgement that the insight offered was both rare and invaluable. Richard's hands hovered over the paper, brushing lightly across key clauses, a careful deliberation in his posture signaling the first hints of respect, a recognition of competence where before there had been assumption and oversight. Aaliyah's gaze remained steady, her voice calm, the rhythm of her speech measured, each word a calculated move in the quiet negotiation of intellect and influence. The sunlight shifted again, casting a warm glow over her features, the soft reflection on the polished surfaces creating a visual reinforcement of her clarity and focus. Around them, the room remained still, the subtle movements of assistants and junior staff conveying silent astonishment, the collective understanding that something extraordinary had unfolded without fanfare, without claim, simply through knowledge, poise, and the courage to speak. Richard finally let out a slow, deliberate breath, leaning back, fingers interlaced, the room now resonating with the unspoken acknowledgement that the balance of authority had subtly, irrevocably shifted, and as Aaliyah stepped back, adjusting the folder neatly, the sunlight catching the edge of her sleeve, the boardroom seemed to hold its breath, suspended in the quiet power of recognition, leaving the sense that this was only the beginning of a story that would unfold beyond the walls of the polished office, the implications of her intervention echoing in the minds of everyone present. The room held a quiet intensity as Aaliyah Carter remained standing near the edge of the polished oak table, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the executives and finally resting on Richard Hawthorne, whose expression had shifted from measured skepticism to a contemplative acknowledgement. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, casting elongated shadows across the marble floor and highlighting the subtle details of her calm composure. The gentle sway of her braid as she adjusted the folder beneath her hands, the slight tilt of her head signaling confidence without arrogance. Each word she spoke carried clarity, precision, and a sense of unshakable understanding. The articulation of complex legal nuances flowing smoothly as she traced potential liabilities, strategic adjustments, and mitigations with deliberate gestures that guided attention to the key sections without overwhelming the room. Richard's eyes followed every movement, fingers resting lightly on the armrest, the tension in his posture giving way to curiosity and silent respect, his usual air of unassailable authority now tempered by the undeniable competence of the young woman before him. The faint hum of the air conditioning blended with the subtle scratching of pens on paper, the rustle of documents shifting gently as assistants leaned forward to follow the conversation, every movement punctuating the weight of Aaliyah's insight. She paused momentarily, allowing the room to absorb the implications of her observations, the sunlight glinting on the ink of her annotations, casting tiny reflections that danced across the table in rhythm with her steady, measured breaths. The boardroom felt both vast and intimate, a space transformed by the quiet authority she projected, each executive caught between admiration and the realization that the dynamics of power had begun to shift in subtle, yet undeniable ways. Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze scanning the documents once more, tracing her notes, absorbing not just the content but the meticulous attention to detail, the foresight, and the courage required to present these observations without hesitation. Aaliyah shifted her stance slightly, maintaining an even, poised presence, the soft shuffle of her shoes against the marble floor marking the rhythm of a room suspended in concentrated awareness. Outside the windows, the city continued its unknowing pace, distant traffic and muted voices providing an understated backdrop to the microcosm of recognition forming inside, where intellect, preparation, and composure quietly commanded acknowledgement. Each subtle movement, each deliberate word, reinforced the growing realization among the executives that respect and authority could be earned not merely by position or title, but by clarity, insight, and the willingness to speak truth with unwavering poise. The room seemed to breathe in unison, the tension easing slightly yet remaining charged with anticipation, the silent acknowledgement of Aaliyah's competence settling over the space like a gentle but firm shift in perspective, leaving everyone aware that the balance of influence had subtly but irrevocably begun to transform under the quiet command of a young woman who had simply prepared, observed, and stepped forward at exactly the right moment. Richard Hawthorne leaned back slightly, the leather of his chair creaking under the shift, and for the first time, his eyes lingered on Aaliyah Carter with a quiet curiosity that bordered on respect. The afternoon sunlight had deepened, casting long, soft shadows across the marble floor and the polished surfaces of the table, illuminating her calm stance and the precise placement of her notes. Aaliyah's voice carried steadily as she continued to navigate the intricate layers of the contract, explaining potential pitfalls and corrective measures with clarity that was impossible to ignore, each point delivered with measured cadence and quiet confidence. The executives around them remained motionless, absorbed in her every word, pens and tablets momentarily forgotten, their collective attention drawn to the depth of insight unfolding before them. Richard's gaze moved from the annotations to her expression, noting the subtle interplay of focus and composure, the way her eyes tracked each line with methodical care, the slight lift of her brow signaling a point of emphasis. Outside the tall windows, the city buzzed on, indifferent to the quiet power dynamic evolving inside. Yet within this space, every subtle gesture, every carefully chosen phrase seemed to ripple outward, influencing the room's energy and recalibrating perceptions of authority. Aaliyah pointed toward a critical clause, her hand steady, her explanation precise and deliberate, illuminating both the risk and the solution with a clarity that left no ambiguity, and Richard's hands hovered near the edge of the table as he processed the depth of her analysis. The soft hum of the ventilation system and the faint scratch of papers under shifting hands created a rhythm that underscored the intensity of the moment, punctuating her words and the thoughtful pauses that allowed the room to absorb each layer of insight. Slowly, Richard's shoulders relaxed as he recognized the thoroughness of her preparation, the rare combination of intelligence and poise that demanded acknowledgement without challenge, the quiet power of competence asserting itself in the simplest of ways. The sunlight shifted again, catching the edges of her folders and highlighting the neat precision of her annotations, while her calm, yet commanding presence seemed to expand subtly into the room, influencing not only the flow of conversation, but the unspoken respect of those present. Every executive was now attuned, sensing the shift in authority not by rank, but by merit, the unassuming young woman demonstrating that insight, clarity, and courage could command attention and alter perceptions. Aaliyah's measured explanation drew to a natural pause, the room hanging on the significance of what had been revealed, the faint reflection of sunlight on the table catching the glint of determination in her eyes, leaving Richard momentarily silent as he absorbed the full weight of her analysis and the subtle but undeniable change in the dynamics of power that had begun to take hold within the boardroom. Richard Hawthorne leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the polished table, his gaze fixed on Aaliyah Carter as a subtle change flickered across his expression, the mix of surprise and growing respect undeniable. The sunlight through the tall windows painted long, warm streaks across the marble floor, highlighting the meticulous alignment of her notes, the neat folds of paper that reflected both preparation and care. Aaliyah gestured toward a section of the contract that had previously gone unnoticed, explaining with steady, confident cadence how a single clause could create a cascade of unforeseen implications, her words precise, layered, and unflinching. The executives surrounding them shifted subtly, leaning in to catch every detail, pens poised but unused, their attention completely captured by the clarity and depth of her insight. The faint hum of the air conditioning mixed with the soft rustle of papers as she continued, each point reinforced by deliberate, small gestures that directed focus without demanding it, her composure radiating authority without arrogance. Richard's fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, a subtle rhythm that matched the careful articulation of Aaliyah's observations, his brows drawn in thoughtful consideration as he absorbed the implications of each highlighted note. The sunlight glinted off the polished surfaces of the table and chairs, catching the edges of her annotations, creating subtle reflections that framed her in an almost cinematic way, emphasizing the quiet command of the room now rooted in her competence. Aaliyah moved her hands gently over the critical sections, pointing out risk mitigations and alternative approaches, her voice unwavering, the tempo measured to allow the room to process the information fully. Richard exhaled slowly, a faint shift in his posture signaling recognition of the value she brought, the room itself seeming to pause around the subtle acknowledgement that authority was no longer defined by title alone. The soft echo of her words, combined with the visual clarity of her preparation, left an imprint on the observers, reinforcing that insight, poise, and careful reasoning could shift perspectives even in the most formal and hierarchical spaces. Each executive processed the ramifications, the subtle nods and quiet glances reflecting a gradual alignment with her conclusions, the tension in the room tempered by the undeniable presence of competence that Aaliyah projected effortlessly. The distant city noises beyond the glass walls were barely audible, a muted contrast to the concentrated focus within, as Richard finally allowed a measured, thoughtful pause, absorbing the full scope of her intervention. The room suspended in the quiet power of revelation, the unspoken acknowledgement that Aaliyah's precise understanding and calm confidence had irrevocably influenced the dynamic, leaving an anticipation that the next steps would be guided not by assumption or hierarchy, but by the clear, deliberate insight she had so methodically presented. Richard Hawthorne remained silent for a moment longer than seemed natural, his fingers interlaced over the edge of the polished table as he absorbed the depth of Aaliyah Carter's observations. The sunlight had shifted lower, streaking the room with a warm amber glow that highlighted the meticulous alignment of her notes and the calm precision of her posture. Each executive present seemed caught between admiration and contemplation, pens and tablets forgotten, eyes tracking every subtle gesture and inflection of her voice. Aaliyah continued, not with urgency, but with deliberate clarity, articulating the cascading effects of the clauses she had highlighted, demonstrating a strategic awareness that extended beyond the immediate contract to broader implications for the company and its stakeholders. The faint hum of the ventilation system punctuated the intensity. Every rustle of paper or soft step she took magnifying the focus on her words. Richard's usual composure, forged through decades of authority, began to waver subtly, his sharp gaze softening as he considered the thoroughness and foresight embedded in her analysis. The room seemed to contract around her quiet confidence, every movement and syllable reinforcing the gravity of her intervention, and even the assistants at the back shifted in their seats, exchanging glances that acknowledged the rare combination of insight and courage she had displayed. Aaliyah's hand traced a line along the margin, pointing to a section that represented a potential risk and proposing a measured alternative, her tone calm, yet persuasive, her delivery imbued with a sense of inevitability that drew Richard's attention entirely. He exhaled slowly, the soft sound resonating in the quiet room, and for the first time allowed a subtle nod of recognition to accompany his careful examination of the documents. The sunlight caught the edges of her braid and the smooth fold of her uniform, casting delicate reflections across the table that mirrored the clarity and precision she conveyed through her voice. Each executive absorbed the implications, their posture reflecting a gradual alignment with the insight she presented, and the air itself seemed charged with the acknowledgement that authority could be earned through knowledge and composure rather than position alone. Richard's lips pressed into a thin line as he continued to study the details, his eyes occasionally flicking to Aaliyah, registering the quiet mastery and unwavering poise she exhibited. The city beyond the windows went on unknowing, traffic and pedestrians a distant murmur compared to the concentrated attention in the room. Yet the significance of her intervention resonated strongly within these walls, shaping the perception of power and influence in a subtle but undeniable way. Aaliyah allowed a brief pause, letting her observations settle, the room suspended in the quiet affirmation that she had not only identified critical issues, but also demonstrated, through calm confidence and meticulous preparation, that competence and insight could redefine expectations, leaving Richard momentarily still, the weight of recognition settling over him as he prepared to reconsider the next steps in light of her unassailable clarity. The atmosphere in the boardroom shifted subtly as Aaliyah Carter folded the last document and placed it neatly on the polished table, her movements precise, unhurried, yet imbued with a quiet authority that seemed to ripple through the room. The sunlight filtered through the tall windows, creating a warm, soft glow that highlighted the meticulous organization of her notes and the composed strength in her posture. Richard Hawthorne leaned back, fingers steepled, his gaze fixed intently on her, a flicker of realization crossing his features as he processed the thoroughness of her analysis and the depth of foresight it revealed. The executives surrounding them remained still, absorbing the implications of her intervention, pens and tablets momentarily idle, every eye drawn to the confident clarity of her presentation. Aaliyah's voice, calm and deliberate, outlined a final series of recommendations, bridging risk management and strategic advantage with a level of precision that left no room for doubt. Each point reinforced with the quiet authority of someone who had mastered both the content and the delivery. The faint hum of the air conditioning underscored the intensity, punctuating the subtle shifting of papers and the occasional soft scuff of her shoes as she adjusted her stance, maintaining poise and focus. Richard's brow furrowed slightly, then eased, a silent acknowledgement of competence forming as he recognized the rare combination of intellect, preparation, and courage she had displayed, the balance of the room tilting subtly toward her insight. The sunlight glinted off the polished surfaces, casting reflections that highlighted the care and precision in every margin note, every annotation, every deliberate gesture she had made, reinforcing the impression of skill and poise. Aaliyah allowed a brief pause, letting the weight of her observations settle, the room absorbing not just the content but the manner of its presentation, the quiet authority that demanded attention without demanding authority. Around them, subtle nods and the faint lean of attentive executives reflected the growing acknowledgement of her influence, the room now aligned with the clarity and depth she had brought forward. Richard exhaled slowly, the sound resonating through the high-ceilinged room, and for the first time allowed a small, reflective smile to touch his lips, the recognition that leadership and respect were not solely derived from title, but could be earned through insight, diligence, and courage. The soft echo of her words lingered in the polished space, the sunlight continuing to cast long, warm streaks across the floor and table, framing Aaliyah as the quiet center of attention, her presence leaving an indelible mark on the perception of those around her. And as she straightened slightly, adjusting her braid and posture, the room seemed to hold its breath, suspended in the acknowledgement that the intervention she had delivered would influence decisions and perspectives long after this moment, leaving an open anticipation for the consequences and opportunities that her clarity and composure had set into motion. The boardroom had settled into a rare, almost reverent silence, the late afternoon sunlight pouring through the tall windows and casting a soft glow across the polished marble floor, illuminating every careful detail of Aaliyah Carter's poised presence. Richard Hawthorne leaned back in his chair, fingers lightly clasped, absorbing the full impact of her meticulous review, the subtle shift in his expression betraying a mixture of awe, respect, and a dawning realization of how thoroughly he had underestimated her. Every executive in the room sat motionless, pens untouched, eyes fixed on her steady gaze and deliberate gestures. The quiet authority she projected commanding attention without a word raised in volume or demand. Aaliyah spoke with calm assurance, summarizing the cascading insights she had uncovered, connecting potential risks to solutions with a clarity that left no ambiguity, her explanations threading through complex contractual and strategic considerations with elegant precision. The sunlight caught the edge of her braid, the soft sheen reflecting across the tabletop, a visual testament to the careful preparation and presence she brought into the room. Richard exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing, and a faint smile of acknowledgement appeared as he registered the depth of her understanding, the room itself feeling lighter, yet charged with the unspoken recognition that balance and respect had shifted subtly but irrevocably. Aaliyah allowed a brief pause, letting the weight of her words settle, her posture unyielding but composed, her calm breathing a quiet counterpoint to the intensity of the moment, and the faint rustle of paper as she adjusted the documents emphasized the control and poise she maintained throughout. Outside the windows, the city moved on, oblivious to the transformative microcosm within, while inside, the executives began to exchange subtle nods, the acknowledgement of her insight radiating quietly through the room, a silent chorus of recognition that transcended position and hierarchy. Richard's eyes followed her every motion, from the careful placement of her notes to the deliberate manner in which she articulated complex points, and he realized that this young woman's influence extended far beyond a single contract, shaping perceptions, guiding strategy, and quietly commanding respect through intellect and composure alone. The soft hum of the air conditioning underscored the moment, creating a rhythm in which every word, every gesture, and every glance carried weight, each executive absorbing the implications and recalibrating their understanding of authority and capability. Aaliyah's final glance swept across the room, her eyes meeting Richard's with subtle affirmation, the quiet power of her presence lingering, leaving the space charged with anticipation. And as she gathered her documents and straightened slightly, the sunlight reflected one last time on the polished surfaces, framing her as the unassuming center of influence, the room holding its breath in acknowledgement that competence, preparation, and quiet courage had quietly, yet irrevocably, altered the perception of power and set into motion a new understanding that would resonate far beyond the polished walls of the boardroom.